loss of life.
I think what bothers you about this is that this represents the epitome of the technology that our country has, and everything that we've ever put into space technology manifests itself in the shuttle program. And for something like this to go wrong, what do? You start from scratch again.
Whenever you hear about something like this, you always have some kind of shock, because you know, it's out of the ordinary, and you don't expect things like this to happen.
Once again, Kennedy Space Center, the flag at half-staff today. Of course, more people are killed in regular airplane accidents or in tornadoes, sometimes even in car accidents. And while we're moved by those tragedies as well, we're bound together by this one because we all seem to be attached to the space program in one fashion or another. We have an emotional and a political and even a financial stake in it. And we have such an attachment to the astronauts, and especially to Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher who was representing all the school teachers in the country. And in her own way, she was representing the vicarious thrills for the rest of us, too, by going up there. She was a risk-taker with the regular astronauts in hopes that she could advance her knowledge about what goes on in outer space and then share that knowledge with a new generation of young students. Jake Garn, a senator from Utah, recently completed successfully a space shuttle orbital flight of about 1 week, as I recall, altogether. He talked about it today with great feeling in the Senate gallery about his friends.
All right. Reaction to what happened today?
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
What does this do to the space program here and its support on the Hill, Senator?
Well, I have great confidence in the space program. I think it's a remarkable system, and I think we should push ahead after we have determined the cause. Obviously, we should not fly until we have determined the cause of this particular failure. But I think we need to look at all of the successes, the remarkable safety record that the space program has had, the benefits that come from it, and the crew members that I knew so well. I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating those?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator. You're putting more fuel to bring more power. And, of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids. We don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
Senator, you were the first non-trained astronaut. Missions that NASA had scheduled for this year. Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But, yes, I think the program was mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter, yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the Civilians in Space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia, originally, during the test phase, when they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham-Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator Jake Garn, Republican of Utah, who flew successfully in a space shuttle, and as you heard him say today, he had friends on board. This crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger that blew up in space 1 minute and 15 seconds after launch, approximately, about 5 miles up. Apparently, they were all killed. As for the NASA investigation, NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Chris Wallace has just told me over the telephone that he is hearing at the White House that NASA will appoint a high official of that agency who is not connected with the Space Shuttle program to head the investigation. Now, NASA, of course, has a number of responsibilities, so there will be a high official of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration who will be heading up this investigation. We have been awaiting an official word from NASA on what happened today and the ultimate fate, of course, of the 7-person astronaut crew. We just now have been informed that that probably will not occur for another 6 minutes or so. They are gathered at the Kennedy Space Center and also at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Vice President Bush and a congressional delegation that includes Senator John Glenn and Senator Garn, whom we just heard on videotape, headed for the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where they will be the president's official representatives. The president himself is expected to address the nation at last we heard at 5 p.m. today, Eastern Time. That would be in about 41 minutes from now. So apparently he'll come up right after we hear from NASA officials at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm sure that this is all being carefully coordinated. That is, that the White House is on the telephone with NASA officials both in Washington, Houston, and in Florida, finding out just what went wrong, and they'll be sharing that with us as soon as they can. The NASA officials will be. It really is one of the remarkable features of the American space program, as opposed to, say, what goes on in the Soviet Union, that through good times and bad, NASA does talk to the people through the American press. That you'll remember in the early days of the space shuttle program, there were some embarrassing moments when we were all there with the cameras trained on the launch pad, and yet there was a computer glitch in the final seconds, and so we had to wait for another full 24 hours and then another 24 hours after that. We saw earlier those tragic pictures of Chaffee, Grissom, and White when they were killed 19 years ago on the launch pad in a fire in a Mercury capsule atop a Saturn rocket as they were preparing for the Apollo space program. So NASA, along the way, has been a very open agency, sometimes very painfully. And we are now told that it will be another 10 minutes before we hear from NASA today at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. That could slip even more for all we know. Let us show you once again, as we have so often today, just what happened. And if I may, I'm just going to borrow this, this model. And it may seem redundant to those of you who have been watching all afternoon long, but there are a number of people who are joining us along the way, so we're going to repeat what we know as best we know it throughout the day here. This, of course, is the space shuttle as it is set up. This is the vehicle itself. The Challenger was set up just like that on the space pad in Florida today, and it launched in that configuration. If we open it up, you'll remember seeing the great bay there. How does it get into space? Well, it gets into space because it is propelled by all of this, really. There are two solid rockets on either side. They develop 1 million pounds of thrust on takeoff, and then they're jettisoned. That is, they peel away and they are parachuted to Earth, and they're recovered in the ocean so they can be used again. This, however, is in effect a kind of bomb. It's a Roman candle taking off, if you will, with a lot of extraneous power. In here, more than 500,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and hydrogen. And that fuels, at extremely cold temperatures, the main engines, which are located here at the bottom of the vehicle, through some ducts that are located down there. Now, there was some ice that had formed there earlier today. Whether that had anything to do with the problem or not, we don't know. We now want to show you slow motion of what happened today, 1 minute and 15 seconds after takeoff, at about 3 times the speed of sound. There's the shuttle on the bottom. And then, as you can see, a fireball races through the length of the external tank, and there's this enormous explosion. And debris begins to rain down through the Florida skies, peeling off to the right one of the solid rockets.
We're hooking up with Dr.
So the indication is that the explosion was not in that rocket, at least. And that's what happened. And as we indicated to you a few moments ago, we expect in about 10 minutes or so to have from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I have to get this out of the way because we have a guest coming up here dealing with science policy. Tell me who you are.
I'm John Logston. I'm the director of the Science Policy Program at George Washington University here in Washington. Spent 20 years of a career tracing the history and development of the U.S. civilian space program.
There's been an awful lot of speculation so far today, Mr. Logston, as you know, about what happens now to the American space program. This, quite plainly, is a very serious setback. Is it your guess that there will be a major reevaluation, not of the effort to go into space, because that will go forward? I mean, science will go on at this point.
It must.
It must indeed, because that's part of the risk, that how we learn, after all. But what about the shuttle program and whether or not we should have a more broadly based program rather than, as I have been saying here this afternoon, all of our eggs in this one basket?
Well, one big difference between the last accident 19 years ago and this time is that we've got 24 successes before this tragedy. We know the shuttle system works and works well. Fragile and obviously risky. Every time it goes off, it's risky. We now have 3 in the spare parts for 1 more if we choose to put it together. But we clearly need a broader base for access to space. To depend on one system for everything we want to do is probably not good planning.
So we don't have to scrap the shuttle program altogether, but what we ought to be doing is looking at whether or not we want to concentrate on the shuttle program or spread it out a little bit so that we have some rockets that don't have to have manpower required to go up with them.
That's right. There are plenty of things that we've been doing with the shuttle that we could do with expendable launch vehicles. Really, the shuttle ought to be used for what it and it alone can do, and it gives us remarkable capabilities in those areas.
Has the shuttle been worth it so far?
Yes.
Setting apart this tragedy, of course.
Setting apart, but it has opened up living, working, finding out what human capabilities are in space in a way that cannot be done.
And yet we're well behind the curve that NASA originally set out in terms of expectations about how it could be paid for and how many launches that they could have.
Oh, indeed. But part of that is not NASA's fault. It's a public decision not to spend the money, make the investment at the pace that could have resulted in a much faster program. Part of it is the kind of optimists that people that want to go in space are, that always look at the high end of expectations.
Mr. Washington, what is this going to do to the President's Star Wars program or the Strategic Defense Initiative?
I don't think it has anything to do with it, except the shuttle was a test bed for a lot of those experiments. It does show, it seems to me, how risky, how uncertain doing things in space still is, to have a whole defense system based on technology that has to work.
And politically, that will open some fresh territory, won't it, for the President's critics?
I believe so.
Mr. Washington, as you look at the space program and the American attitudes toward about it, have we become too blasé about high technology and the leading edge of technology, about what it can do and the risks that are involved?
Well, I think that the shuttle was supposed to be routine, and we were beginning to treat it as routine. What was special about this mission was Krista McAuliffe. Otherwise, it would have been just another mission. The other 6 people are not public personalities, equally as adventurous and taking as many risks. The public was excited this weekend as we got the images back from Uranus. The program continues to both do routine, useful things and break out into the future.
Mr. Washington, thanks very much for coming by.
Right.
From George Washington University.
That's correct.
Lifetime of study, effectively, all of your adult life, of science policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are awaiting now in about 3 minutes, as I say, the news conference. And before we go to Steve Delaney, what we want to do is show you briefly a piece of videotape that we have here in Washington. Congressman Bill Nelson, who made a ride in the last shuttle that went up successfully. And he talked about whether or not these astronauts who were involved in today's explosion had any chance at all. Congressman Bill Nelson.
Even if there had been ejection seats, from my knowledge of the system and observing today what happened, there would not have been any opportunity for escape by ejecting, given the flame that consumed after the initial explosion. In my personal knowledge, would I know if anybody would have, on that crew, had a chance to know that something was wrong? And the answer to that is no.
If there's anything, I suppose, that we can be grateful for, it appears to us, at least, from the naked eye, from this distance, that any deaths that may have occurred, that appear to have occurred, all those deaths were instantaneous. It was an explosion of great magnitude. As I indicated to you a few moments ago, Roy Neal was told by scientists that that was an explosion the equivalent of a small nuclear charge. To put it quite bluntly, it does appear that those astronauts and Krista McAuliffe simply didn't know what hit them. That the explosion happened instantaneously. And of course, as you saw, there were lots of pieces of debris that rained down into the Atlantic Ocean. At the Kennedy Space Center now at Cape Canaveral, Florida, Steve Delaney, who has been there all day long witnessing what for him was a thrilling moment, the liftoff of the space shuttle, and it is for those of you who have not seen it. When you see it in person, there's nothing quite like it. And then had that thrill turn into a horror of watching the space shuttle come apart in the skies. What's the latest from there, Steve, in terms of what the NASA scientists are going to tell us and when?
I wish I could preview it. We just don't know, Tom. They've been sliding this back about 5 minutes at a time for quite a while now. Jess Moore is going to conduct the briefing. Apparently, he's going to do it himself. Jess Moore has been running the manned space program. NASA is a little bit understaffed at the top right now because James Beggs, the administrator, is kind of on a leave of absence while he handles some legal problems. Jess Moore has been running it as the associate director for manned spaceflight, which means he's in charge of those who are associated with the shuttle program. And earlier, before any of this took place, he was the one who was conducting the briefings to say that, well, there was a problem with the weather here or there, or in the case of the delay that rolled the thing over until through the weekend, there was a problem with a mechanical device, a door handle of all things, that they couldn't quite pull out because it has to be replaced before they can lift off. And Jess Moore was the one who was in charge. He's in transit. He's on his way to assume administration of the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and from now on that'll be his post, and there'll be another person assigned here to take care of the manned spaceflight program. But he will conduct the briefing, and I'd like to be able to suspect that the reason they've been putting it back is perhaps they are trying to collate and gather together little bits and pieces of information which would allow him to give us as definitive a look as we've had yet as to, if not why it happened, certainly what happened. And the briefing is about to begin, and the speaker is Hugh Harris, the spokesman.
Delaney?
Yes, Tom.
All right, here we are now.
As I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WTHR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay, Al Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now.
Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with any of with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
Yeah, this is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Okay. Bruce Nichols.
Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, and the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days so we can sit down and assess this. And, you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded, and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jeff, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
I can't hear.
I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore. Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Carroll from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
Eddie or somebody?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our #1 priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impact from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over there.
Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, we only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA Select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, we are manufacturing structural spares for an orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing. We are also buying spares for the current fleet that we have, and there is a production capability there if and when it's decided that that's the next step we want to do, is to move forward and do that. So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, that is a possibility, that we could implement a production capability for another orbiter if that were decided to be the thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to wind this up now. Mr. Moore has to get back immediately. As you know, he's been here since very early in the morning, and there's much to be done. Thank you all. Thank you.
That's the news conference from the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, where we heard Jess Moore with the first definitive, although not wide-ranging, reaction of NASA to what happened today at about 1 minute and 30 seconds, as he indicated, after a liftoff of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It blew up. He would not speculate at all on what may have happened. He would not even say whether he believed that the shuttle itself, that is the aircraft, the space aircraft, was consumed in the explosion or whether it went down intact, and then we believe if it did that, in fact, it would have broken up when it hit the water. He would not even comment on that. He did say that all tapes, all notes, all reactions now have been impounded, and there will be a full investigation. And he says, I regret, I have to report that there is no evidence that any member of the crew survived this explosion. And as we have been looking at this gigantic fireball all day long, there is no indication that anyone could have survived that no ejection system could have permitted any kind of an escape to safety on the part of the 7 people on board, including Krista McAuliffe. Here once again is the stop action. That is the shuttle itself on the bottom part, as you can see. The solid rocket booster is the white one atop that. And then the big external tank seems to just come apart, as you can see. And as the fire races through it, it triggers this enormous explosion. It's the dark area between the 2 white areas that we're looking at. That's the external tank, although it's not well defined in this picture. This is it in slow motion. You see where that begins to break up there? Well, the solid rocket booster itself continues to go, and then we saw it break away. Now, there's another one on the other side, of course, but it does appear that it's the solid rocket booster, and that flame, as you can see, consumes the space shuttle in which 7 astronauts, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old, of Concord, New Hampshire, tragically watched by her husband and her 2 children today, as well as by her parents. And they could barely believe their eyes as they watched that unfold in the bright blue skies over Florida. It was a tragic end to what everyone had hoped would be a triumphant flight for this young school teacher and her 6 associates, who were all veteran members of the astronaut program. To bring you up to date, in about 9 minutes, we expect to hear from President Reagan speaking directly to the nation from the Oval Office. All other official business today in this nation's capital, as you might expect, has been set aside. The President was scheduled to address the joint session of Congress tonight, a brief thematic speech of what he hoped for the next year. That now has been postponed at least a week until next Tuesday night is the current schedule. The President will speak to us at 5 o'clock in 9 minutes Eastern Time from the White House tonight. And then we'll have a brief pause after that, and we'll go on with our business of covering this story. The President received word of this tragedy while he was preparing for a briefing today in the Oval Office. It was delivered to him by Vice President Bush and Admiral Poindexter, who is the Chief of National Security Affairs for the White House. The President then watched a television replay. It was, of course, the idea of his administration to put a teacher in space in an effort to engage this generation in space exploration and what can be learned from it. Krista McAuliffe was chosen in a nationwide competition, then selected from 10 finalists. Mrs. Reagan was watching in the private quarters upstairs live when the explosion occurred. Her reaction was to say, "Oh my God," and then to pray, hope against hope, that somebody could survive. Robert Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Bob, based on what Jess Moore had to say so far, apart from the fact that we know that there will be a procedure involved in the investigation and that all future flights are, for the moment at least, frozen, we didn't learn a great deal, but that's understandable, isn't it?
It is understandable because obviously they don't know a great deal yet. However, there was one point that might give us a clue to what's going to happen in the next few days and weeks and months. Which was a question that he didn't really answer that came from William Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times, which is to do with whether there is a news blackout here. And it could be interpreted either way, but it sounds like NASA doesn't want to have a whole lot to say for a long time, and so it may be a while before we know what goes on. The NASA, under the Reagan administration, has taken a slightly different attitude about how it relates to the press. It certainly has been open. It certainly is showing us everything, but they haven't been as eager to share everything with the press as they were under previous administrations. It'll be very interesting to see how they respond now when they're under a great deal of pressure, when there'll be a great demand to get leaks to try to find out what's going on. But right now it looks like they're clamping down everything. They want to, as he said, to impound everything, including the notes that the engineers, technicians made on the pad to try to find out. So it doesn't look like we're going to find anything out for a long time. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where, as I indicated earlier, he was out there for some developments in the Voyager space program. That's the unmanned space probe, of course, that just sent back those extraordinary pictures of the moons of Uranus. So it has been a 3 or 4 day period of the trials and triumphs of space, the tragedies and the triumphs, really, because there was so much to be learned from those pictures as well. And We had all hoped that we would learn something from this space shuttle. To hear from Krista McAuliffe, a gifted young teacher filled with enthusiasm and energy. Tragically, her children, Scott 9 and Caroline 6, were there today when it all blew up. And in Concord, New Hampshire, a school auditorium filled with students watching first with unrestrained joy and then in disbelief as they saw those television pictures of the contrails spewing off debris into the Atlantic Ocean today as well. We want to talk to you just for a few moments, if we can, about these people who are all involved, not only Krista McAuliffe, but the other 6 regular members of the astronaut crew as well. We don't want to lose sight of who they were. This is Francis Richard Scobie. He was a 46-year-old commander, a Vietnam veteran. His wife's name is June. They have 2 children. Career Air Force officer, rank of major. He had talked to Bob Bazell earlier about the prospect that at some point one of these would blow up, and he said he wasn't sure that the country was prepared for that. Another member of the crew, Gregory Jarvis, 41-year-old payload specialist. That is, that he worked back in the payload bay on the various experiments and the satellite launches that they would be involved in. His wife's name is Marcia, 3 children. He's an engineer with Hughes Aircraft Company. He was bumped from the earlier December shuttle in favor of Congressman Bill Nelson, whom we heard from earlier today. And then, of course, our school teacher, and she did in a way belong to all of us, Sharon Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old. Her husband's name is Stephen. She has 2 children, as I indicated. She was going to conduct, in effect, classrooms in space. Her legacy was to be that she would be the first teacher to successfully complete a mission. It will not be that now. Ronald McNair, one of 4 black astronauts in the program. He's 45 years old. He has 2 children and a magna cum laude graduate of North Carolina A&T. He's a Ford Foundation fellow. He's a mission specialist. That means that he doesn't fly the spacecraft. He works on the various programs that are involved there. Ellison S. Onizuka, 39-year-old mission specialist. His wife's name is Lorna. They have 2 children. He was a U.S. Air Force test pilot and a Commendation Medal winner. And I'm unable to see our picture to tell you what we're showing you at this time. There's Judith Resnick. She is a Ph.D. in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She's one of the women in the astronaut program, the 2nd woman to go into space. And, of course, she was looking forward to a successful mission. And tragically, she too died. Michael Smith, a 40-year-old co-pilot. His wife, Jane, has 3 children. He's a Navy test pilot. He holds 5 military honors. A mix, really, of scientists, civilians, and military flyers who were brought together, along with a school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, on really a day that will live in our darkest memory, when all that goes wrong went wrong all at once in the space program. This space program from which we have expected only success and achievement, human achievement and technological achievement. Today, those expectations, those beliefs were just shattered for us in the skies over Florida.
The hydraulic power units have started. T-minus 21 seconds,
monitor.
And the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly.
As you can see,
3 engines running normally.
we're approaching the critical stage. They're going from 65% power to 104% power.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
They were at about 5 miles in space, 18 miles downrange.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up.
The last words from Richard Scobie. Then the explosion.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The debris began to scatter across the sky.
Fred? I must have monitors up there.
As I say, we have shown that to you repeatedly again and again and again today. It is not that we have a ghoulish curiosity. We just think that it's important that all members of the audience who are coming to their sets at different times of the day have an opportunity to see it. And, of course, everyone is led to their own speculation based on what happened here today as well. We are now awaiting the arrival of President Reagan in the Oval Office, where he will directly address the nation on this tragedy. All schedules have been scrambled here in Washington, as I'm sure that they have been across the country today, as we try to deal with the enormity of this tragedy. What we have here is the President speaking to the nation today about this national tragedy, as it was described by Jess Moore, instead of addressing the country tonight on what he had hoped would be a message of hope and peace and a forward-looking future for America, talking about family values and the hope of the economy. That was the State of the Union address, which has now been, of course, postponed until next Tuesday, and the President will talk to us from the Oval Office. Chris Wallace will be standing by thereafter to talk about the investigation machinery that has already been put in place. The White House on a stark and somber day. The President was informed as he prepared for his State of the Union address tonight. It was his idea, as I indicated earlier, to put a teacher in space, and he felt, as he indicated to reporters when he met with them earlier at the Roosevelt Room, a great personal loss and sympathy, thinking especially of the husband and the children of Krista McAuliffe, who was lost today in that explosion. And now here is the President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers and overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space, There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
This is WTHR Channel 13, Indianapolis.
Have main engine start.
At 11:39 this Tuesday morning, the Shuttle Challenger and the country were filled with high hopes and great expectations for a crew of 7, including America's first teacher to travel into space. 75 seconds later, the world paused.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
Live from the News Center of Indiana, this is Live at 5 with Tom Cochran, Kim Hood, Bob Gregory's exclusive AccuWeather, and Daryl Burnett Sports.
This is a day we'll all remember, a very sad day. While experts look for answers, most of us remain stunned at the apparent loss of 7 American astronauts in the tragedy of the Challenger.
3 engines running normal.
Bothersome technical and weather delays behind her, Challenger had lifted from Earth at 11:38. The 56th American manned mission into space. It was the 25th shuttle launch, and it looked spectacular. Then, about a minute and 15 seconds later, at an altitude of about 9 miles, triumph turned to tragedy.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The NASA narrator was reading telemetry tapes, not looking at a monitor. It seemed as though no one could believe what we were watching. For a full 33 seconds, nothing was said. And then...
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Scientists say the explosion which consumed the craft was the size of a small nuclear blast. There is no indication if it occurred in the solid boosters or in the shuttle's main engines, which are fueled by 500,000 gallons of volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. Disaster came as they were throttling the engines.
At that point, we had an apparent explosion.
At breakfast this morning, the crew knew they were to be historic. On board was the first civilian astronaut, Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space, who said goodbye to her children in Concord, New Hampshire to begin her training. Her family was in the viewing stands at the Cape. While they watched in disbelief, flight controllers were marshaling recovery crews.
We had an impact in the water downrange at a location approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west.
It was 45 minutes before they could enter the area because of debris which rained from the Challenger. President Reagan has canceled tonight's State of the Union address and just moments ago expressed the nation's condolences.
Tom, NASA, in its first official comment about the shuttle tragedy, confirms that there appear to be no survivors. NASA has announced it is forming an investigative board that will conduct an exhaustive crash review by looking at everything from flight data recordings to astronaut notes. And NASA says there will be no quick conclusions as to what went wrong and why.
I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy.
In addition to the investigative board, there will be a formal review panel set up. NASA says it will not launch another shuttle until it has some answers.
A couple in West Lafayette is closer to the shuttle astronauts than most. Robert Forster was a finalist to be first teacher aboard the shuttle. Bill Gephardt is in the news center now, having just returned from talking to Forster. Bill?
Yeah, Tom, and like everyone else, Robert Forster and his wife Lee are shocked by the events of the day. This afternoon, Forster's been taking calls from across the country, both from news organizations and from people associated with the space program, while watching television and waiting for word. The 6th grade math teacher was at a satellite dish store watching the launch, arranging for classes to see the official tape of the launch. At home now, he says the shock of the tragedy and the loss of fellow teacher Krista McAuliffe may take a lifetime to fully realize.
I worked with Krista, of course, during the summer and going through the training, the selection process, and we kept in touch so that we could coordinate our efforts for teaching the lessons on board. And then I had met the other astronauts at different banquets or meetings and conferences and had been introduced to them and shared ideas with them on the mission, what we could accomplish, what was practical. It's just awful to have to think that seven people you knew were lost. It just heightens the risk, I guess, when we see the terrible auto accidents on the road. You know, it makes you think, I guess, about driving a little more carefully. And I would just reevaluate, you know, if I were selected.
Lee Forster echoes her husband's words and told us her thoughts now center around Krista McAuliffe's young daughter. She says the girl wanted her mother to stay on the ground, not go aboard the shuttle. We will talk more with the Forsters tonight at 6 o'clock. Tom?
Thank you, Bill.
There are other Hoosier connections to the shuttle. On board the Challenger was an experiment designed by a Purdue University sophomore. John Bellinger had hoped to learn how chicks develop in space by sending up 32 eggs in a specially designed incubator. It was hoped as well the experiment could tell scientists more about the changes astronauts go through in space. Also on board Challenger were 2 products from the Muncie Baseball Corporation. Tom?
Kim, former astronaut and Crawfordsville native Joe Allen calls this a very sad day for all of us, a day he says was inevitable. Allen, visibly shaken by the tragedy, was personal friends with 5 of the 7 astronauts aboard Challenger, having trained with them extensively during his 18 years with NASA.
We're dealing with transportation. Transportation, sooner or later, leads to tragedy, and today we experienced that tragedy. I suppose in the course of human events it's inevitable. It's nonetheless a very sad day for all of us. I had friends aboard the space shuttle. They're all our friends, and it's just a great, great loss.
The DePaul graduate rode the shuttle twice into space and says given the chance he would do it again. He retired from NASA last year. He is at Indiana State University for a series of lectures and speeches. Word spread quickly of today's disaster. One of our camera crews was on assignment at the Indianapolis Museum of Art when the explosion occurred. As workers learned of the tragedy, they gathered in an employee lounge to watch coverage there on a television set. Workers were clearly stunned as they watched and listened to the description of what had happened. Stunned and disbelief, the feelings many of us had. While many were simply speechless, others offered some of their reaction to today's disaster.
I thought that there was some warning when they were having problems before with it. So with the weather? With the weather and everything. So it's really a shock. People are taking this for granted for so long, and now this happens, a terrible disaster. It really is.
When you've had so many successful ones, it's a shocker. I've said a prayer for all of them, best you can do now.
It was 19 years ago yesterday that the first and, until today, only loss of life in America's space program occurred. Astronauts Roger Chaffee, Ed White, and Hoosier Gus Grissom died in a fire in their command module. The 3 Apollo astronauts were doing a dress rehearsal on January 27, 1967. Theirs was to be the first launch in the Apollo program, the program which put an American on the moon. The astronauts died in about 13 seconds. The last words came from the capsule from Chaffee, who shouted, "We are on fire. Get us out of here." A faulty electrical wire was later blamed for that fire. Today's tragedy is symbolized around the nation by flags flying at half-staff. Mayor Hudnut ordered all flags lowered today as the world mourns the great loss of 7 brave men and women who perished in their quest for knowledge.
things are disappearing fast at Highland Superstores. Because now through Thursday night, Highland is having its pre-inventory clean sweep sale, and hundreds of items are reduced. Like the Sharp cable-ready VHS video recorder with wireless remote, just $297. And this Toshiba Touch microwave oven with 9 power levels, just $169. By Thursday night, we expect 9,000 deals to be swept away. When the dust clears, there won't be anything left. The Highland Clean Sweep Sale, now through Thursday.
That Hoosier should be knowing about what's coming up in the weather.
Well, we had, winter still, the rage is on here. Well, rage is probably too strong a word, but it's been extremely cold. We'll have another touch of variety of winter for us. Starting later tonight, we may get a little snow, and we think here in the central area, anything from a cover up to possibly an inch, maybe as much as 2 inches in the northern part of our viewing area. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but let's take a look at what's going on outside today. We had 18 degrees for a high note, and the morning low, that came in at 1 above. The current reading out at the airport, by the way, is 18. Here in the weather center downtown, we're at 17 degrees. Skies are overcast, relative humidity at 70%. Our winds now to the southeast, 12 miles an hour. That's giving us a wind chill temperature of 3 degrees below. Barometric pressure, that's starting to recover somewhat now at 29.83, and it is rising. Here's what our Weather Service radar is showing. This just popped up now in the last hour or so, and I'm really not sure whether any of this is reaching the ground as yet. Most of our surface stations are just reporting cloudy skies, but there is some moisture in the atmosphere, and as this moves in from Illinois, we'll begin to see radar thicken up a bit, and we'll start to get some of that snow. Here's what the temperatures look like around the region at the present time. Generally in the teens in the northern part of the state, run into 20s, and then some warmer air down around the Evansville area and in St. Louis. But it's a storm up to the north, which is going to drift through our vicinity and bring the change. This is it, the low-pressure cell. Up here, a steadier amount of snow has taken place, a couple of inches there, and then light snow to a dusting, as we mentioned, out ahead of the warm front. Back in here, relatively mild air after a record-setting cold outbreak in the southeastern part of the country. Some 24 cities set record lows out here. We'll talk more about that for you at 6 o'clock. But a little mild tongue of air in between this system. But as this thing moves through, what the weather map will show at noon tomorrow, it'll be over in the western part of Virginia, continuing to move eastward and take the snow with it. Behind it, high pressure will move in, and then by tomorrow night, this is the way the weather map will look. Our influencing factor will be this area of high pressure, but the air coming around is really a mixture of Arctic and Pacific, so no real cold shot like we just experienced earlier in the week. And then this little culprit could bring a patch of snow our way on Friday, too. But my AccuWeather forecast for tonight, cloudy with intermittent snow. Accumulation around 1 inch, perhaps 2 in the northern part of our viewing area. The good news, temperatures remaining steady or even rising a little bit during the day tomorrow. Variably cloudy skies, a few flurries around. High temperature at 30 degrees. We'll have a west-northwest wind, 8 to 16 miles an hour. And then clearing and quite cold tomorrow night. Low can go anywhere from 6 to 12 degrees, depending on who gets how much snowfall. But temperatures will finally get to the normal 35 by the time we reach the weekend. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Friday looks as though that will be the day when we will get another touch of wind here, just to look at a few snowflakes out there. 6 o'clock, though, we'll be back kind of show a map and check some of those frosty temperatures in the southeastern part of the country.
Thank you, Bob. Story now about the effect of the weather. Parts of central Indiana are now feeling the effects of a flu that forced a number of southwestern Indiana school districts to close their doors last week. In the Brownsburg junior and senior high schools, 16% of the students are absent today, most of them sick with flu-like symptoms. In Zionsville secondary schools, about 13% stayed home, and in some Tippecanoe County schools, 1/3 of the kids are out of class. There is a vaccine available to guard against some strains of the virus causing the present flu symptoms, but an epidemiologist at the State Board of Health says it's not essential to rush out and have your kids vaccinated.
These strains of influenza infect an individual, a young individual,